Intel Celeron versus Intel Pentium 4. That's been something on my mind for a while, and I'd love to know the actual performance benefits of having a Pentium 4, but it seems like everyone online seems to always just focus on the Pentium 4s when it comes to socket 478. So I decided to take matters into my own hand, and I'm going to just try to compare my machine with a Celeron processor versus a Pentium 4 processor. So this is the machine I'm going to be doing the upgrades on. This came with a Pentium 4 1.8 GHz from the Willamette core. Obviously I had to get rid of that because that's a very bad CPU. Wanted something that gets less hot, so I have replaced it with a Northwood Celeron 2.4 GHz. Now this is a Medion computer. It was sold by Aldi in the early 2000s. Officially it only supports 400 MHz FSB, but there's actually a little bit of a trick you can do to get faster CPUs to work in it. We'll get to that in a little bit. Let's take a closer look at the system. So here's the machine on its side. I'm going to remove the side panel, which is actually kind of tricky to take off because it's a very heavy mechanism, and the side panel itself is super heavy and thick as well. This computer is actually super well built. It's got a really well built case, super thick side panel. Considering it's a Aldi PC, it's definitely not the case that they've cheaped out on. So here we have our aforementioned AMD CPU, or well, it's just an AMD fan, don't worry about it. It originally came with a really loud fan, and I decided to just zip tie an AMD fan on top of it because it wouldn't fit, it's slightly bigger, and that solved all the noise complaints that I had with it. So, like I said before, beyond this, there is a 2.4 GHz Intel Celeron CPU, Northwood core, with 400 MHz FSB. And that is all well, it's fully supported. However, I was actually curious, there's apparently a certain code that you can enter, a password you can enter on the BIOS screen. I'll put the details to this trick on the screen. Basically just enter the BIOS with this method, and then you'll be presented with an extra option called frequency voltage control. And here you'll be able to tweak the frontside bus, and via that you can overclock the CPU. Now, however, this didn't actually fully work for me because I wasn't able to pick any of the options. Like, there are many options, and basically none of them worked except for one, other than the base option. I could raise the FSB to 533 MHz from 400, and that resulted us in having a 3.2 GHz Celeron CPU. So that's quite a nice 800 MHz overclock without even raising the voltage, because there's no actual voltage control. So that was a nice surprise, and so therefore I thought this is a super fast machine, but we're still working with a Celeron, so we only have 128 kilobytes of cache, while the Pentium 4s of the era would have 512 kilobytes of cache. So I was wondering, is there really a huge difference between the two? We'll see. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a 2.4 GHz Pentium 4 with 400 MHz FSB. However, those exist. I do not own one of them. They seem to be going up in price. I just didn't really feel like putting any money into this machine. But I do have a 2.8 GHz Northwood Pentium 4 that has a 533 MHz FSB, so we can definitely test that one out and see if we see any difference. Unfortunately, it's not going to be clock for clock, but we're going to have a lot more cache, so that's going to tell me if it really is the cache that's holding us back or if there's something else. Now, there's a little bit of a bottleneck with this machine, namely the fact that it uses SD-RAM. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but those in there are SD-RAMs, so no DDR. 133 MHz SD-RAM is all you get. This is one of the early socket 478 motherboards. However, it still uses the 845 chipset, but it just doesn't have DDR on it. So I thought that must be the biggest bottleneck of the whole system, but I'm not sure. It might have been the CPU not having enough cache. So maybe by simply putting in a Pentium 4 with more cache, we could get a nice FPS boost in many games. Currently, I am getting some symptoms that seem like we're CPU limited, but it could be the RAM. I'm really not sure. So if we're going to swap the CPU over, I'm just really curious to see with the SD-RAM what kind of performance boost we can get. And with SD-RAM, I think the CPU doesn't scale all that well anymore. as we raise the clock frequency, so it just sort of holds it back. SDRAM was really only meant for Willamette core CPUs, so yeah, we'll see what's going to happen if we put in the new CPU. As for the video card, we have my Radeon 9000 Pro in here. That's been doing a pretty good job in here. It's a really decent video card. However, I am considering replacing it at some point. We have an 8cm exhaust fan to cool down the CPU area a bit, and I've replaced the power supply as well. This is a good quality, really heavy 200 watt power supply. It does the job perfectly fine. We are getting way below 200 watts of power consumption on this machine. Funny thing is, actually, the power supply that came with this machine, it was installed upside down, so there was a big 12cm fan, which was actually facing the top of the case. Nice. That's only possible because they actually have screw holes to mount the power supply either way, which is actually kind of impressive, but not quite foolproof, I suppose. Hard drive in this machine is an 80GB IBM DeskStar, really loud, but thankfully, due to this thick case, we have not much noise coming out of it, so that's really nice. And yeah, actually I have the original Toshiba DVD-ROM in this machine, and I still have the original Sony CD burner as well that came with it. However, that's not in the machine right now. I've swapped in a different CPU just out of curiosity to see if it would work, and it does, but this is not the one I'm going to be using. So I tried out this Pentium 4 I have. This is the first ever Pentium 4 that had hyper-threading, so it's the Pentium 4 3.06 GHz, and it does recognize it, and yep, 133 MHz times 23, and we've got 512 kilobytes of cache, so it works, but there doesn't seem to be an option in the BIOS to enable hyper-threading because it's not officially supported, but the CPU will still work, just not in hyper-threaded mode. So just to show you, as it boots up, you can see the Pentium 4 3066 MHz right there. So here's our Pentium 4 Northwood core, 2.8 GHz with 512 kilobytes of L2 cache and 533 MHz FSB. I'm going to put in right there. There's also a chance that this Pentium 4 at 2.8 GHz is going to be slightly cooler than the 3 GHz Pentium, Celeron, 3.2 GHz Celeron. Lower clock speed technically should be lower heat generation, however, hard to tell. The voltage is going to be about the same, as it's the same core, just more cache. But we'll see. I gotta say, I really don't like this heatsink whatsoever. The mounting is terrible. You have to these clips are just absolutely just terrible. Anyways, I think that's just something to do with socket 478. I've not seen a single heatsink that I liked for the 478. It's absolutely dreadful. It's every design I've seen, be it OEM, original Intel, or some third party, is always horrible. I don't know why they cannot get it right. It's horrible. So I hate swapping Pentium 4 CPUs, but hopefully I don't have to touch this anymore. Alright, so now I'm just gonna plop the fan on top, and we'll see if she's all good. Looking good. frequency is already set because we didn't actually have to change the FSB from the previous CPU. And now I've entered the passcode, and you can see that there's an extra frequency voltage control option, and yeah, we have 133 selected. So as you can see, I can pick so many different options. This is the default 100/33, and none of the other ones work for some reason. None of these work at all. Only this one, 133/33. So it was kind of an accident that I figured this out one day. I think I lowered it to 133 just in case. Okay, and that's it. We're pretty much ready to go with this. We don't have a mouse plugged in, but that's okay. Now this is a 2.8 GHz Pentium 4 on the Northwood core, and also is only 533 FSB, so it does not support hyper-threading. Even if the motherboard did, this CPU does not, so it's a perfect fit. Great, I have a disk in the drive. Alright, well anyways, let's take this computer back to the streaming room, and we're going to go run some benchmarks with the new CPU and compare it to the old CPU. So when I first booted up the machine, I started 3D Mark 99 and immediately noticed a huge FPS boost in the first test alone. We went beyond 100 FPS, which we didn't on the old CPU, and sure enough we got 6,767 3D marks on the Celeron with 27,754 CPU marks, whereas with the Pentium 4 we got 8,850 3D marks and close to 35,000 CPU 3D marks. Same story with 3D Mark 2000, we got 5,016 3D marks on the Celeron with 354 CPU score, while on the Pentium 4 we actually got 8,579 3D marks, and our CPU result was somewhere in the 500s, 562. So I couldn't find my footage of running CPUZ on the Celeron CPU, so unfortunately I can only show you it with the Pentium 4, but here it is, fully recognized by CPUZ Vintage Edition. And I'm going to run the benchmark on it. We're going to compare this CPU to a Pentium MMX 200, which is, I know it's not really the best comparison, but the benchmark doesn't seem to have a lot of options when it comes to it. Speaking of the graphics device, I also tried running 3D Mark 2001, but unfortunately it always crashes when I start benchmarking. Ever since I installed the latest ATI drivers, so there might be some problem with that, but anyways, I can test 3D Mark 2001. So we get a pretty high score, 3,531 CPU speed and 8,370, which is definitely higher than what it was with the Celeron. And now let's take a look at some games. We have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. The reason I chose this game is because it's actually quite CPU heavy, so we'll see if we are indeed held back by the CPU. And we have the Celeron on the left and the Pentium 4 on the right, and you could immediately see that the Celeron is struggling with this game. And the Pentium 4, it causes no problems. It handles it pretty well. We're always above 60 FPS, whereas that's not true for the Celeron. And it's slowing down quite heavily. So that's an insane difference, and that's just because we have a lot more cache. We got 4 times the cache, and you can see that actually translates to quite a bit of an FPS boost. Now, unfortunately, we don't have sound for any of the game recordings. Unfortunately, I messed up one of the settings when recording, so sorry about that. Since we checked out Harry Potter 1, let's check out Harry Potter 2 as well, which is also quite CPU intensive. These games actually use the Unreal Engine 2, so the graphics are actually not too bad. And you can immediately see that the Celeron is struggling again with the game, but there are some scenes in the intro that really bring the Celeron to its knees. You'll see shortly, and the Pentium 4 just breezes through it. It does also slow down a tiny bit, but not too bad, not as bad as the Celeron. Immediately we can see that, yeah, frame rate is way higher on the Pentium 4. Again, this is running in 640 by 480, highest settings. So we're definitely not graphics card limited. So this one right here, we're already in the 30s and we haven't even gone inside the bookshop. Yep, 20 FPS. Pretty rough. Well, it's still quite nice on the... Just how insane the fluctuations are in FPS. I mean, we just went from 20 FPS to over 100. It's really strange, but there you go. 16 on the Celeron and 29 on the Pentium 4. So it never really goes below playable level, whereas it did quite often with the Celeron. Even though this is a 2002 game, so it's the same year as the CPUs, I believe. here I'm pointing the camera at the same place, roughly, and you can immediately tell that there's just an enormous difference. 20 FPS, 19 FPS on the Celeron, and 35 on the Pentium 4. That's just huge difference, almost twice as fast on the Pentium 4. Albeit it's still running at a lower clock frequency of only 2.8 GHz versus 3.2. And our final game comparison is going to be Midtown Madness 2 here, which is also a very CPU heavy game. For some reason it's absolutely just insane, the system requirements of this machine. Now when you look at the box, it seems very tame. It recommends you have a Pentium 2 266 MHz. Yeah, right. We're running a Pentium 4 and we're still not quite getting a solid 60 FPS. Quite a bit of slowdowns. This is on the maximum settings though, so like the main setting I think that ruins frame rate in this game is definitely the draw distance. So the draw distance is all the way up, and you can see the CPU is still not having an easy time, but it's definitely much smoother than on the Celeron. It's like a night and day difference. It's almost as if like the Celeron CPU was just like a different class of CPUs, just like a different generation, something much older, but they came out at around the same time. It's just has, you know, quarter of the cache available, and look at that, we've doubled the frame rate at this spot right here, standing here. I mean, 20 FPS is still not great, but certainly better, and you could still tweak the settings to get slightly better FPS. And I've also tried Need for Speed 3 and 4, but I didn't really notice a huge difference between the Celeron and the Pentium 4. We're probably GPU limited on that front, or well, more like we're more like engine limited for the most part, because the games have a 64 FPS cap and we're regularly hitting it. But yeah. Now let's take a look at some DOS benchmarks. These are really made for slower machines than what we have here, but I thought it would be interesting to take a look at it anyways. So we've got 3036 points in SpeedSys for the Celeron, and for the Pentium 4 we've actually got slightly lower, 1952, even though it clearly has more cache and can use it better, but it seems like DOS is just more interested in frequency, clock frequency, than having more cache, despite those graphs looking pretty nice. Here's PC Player benchmark in 640 by 480. There isn't really a huge difference. We got 46.5 on the Celeron and 46.7 on the Pentium 4, so really minuscule difference, but at least it's not slower, so that's good. And now for some Doom. I absolutely hate this benchmark because they make you do some math. They couldn't just tell you the actual FPS that you're getting, because that would have been too easy. So by dividing 74,690 by 588 real ticks, we get 127 FPS on the Celeron, and we get 580 real ticks on the Pentium 4, so that means we get 128.7 FPS on the Pentium 4, so about 1.5 FPS faster roughly. Here we go, Quake, 640 by 480, not 3D accelerated benchmark. We're getting 74.4 FPS on the Celeron. And now let's take a look at the Pentium 4. $74.4. I wonder if this is a memory or a video card limitation. Anyways, I just thought it would be kind of funny to see landmark. And well, look at that. We have, I don't even know what this means, infinite megahertz below scale. And yeah, but it seems like the Pentium 4 is slower in landmark. We are minus minus 29 megahertz instead of minus 20 or so. Well, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. That's all I had to share for today, and hope you learned something new. I certainly did. That Celeron is really slow compared to the Pentium 4, so I'm looking forward to getting better frame rates on this machine from now on with the new Pentium 4 CPU. And in the future I might go ahead and upgrade the video card as well from this Radeon 9000 Pro. Not sure what I'm going to put in it yet, but we'll see. Anyways, I'll see you soon in the next video, and thanks for watching. Also, go stop by at my Twitch stream if you'd like to see some mainly retro gaming, but sometimes new games as well being played, and sometimes I'm tinkering with computers as well. So yeah, come and hang out if you'd like. Links are in the description, and thanks for watching.